Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're talking about a subject that is quite intense, and so I do want to mention before we get into this that I'm providing a content warning for you that there will be discussions of death and violence coming up, and that is because we're talking about the press as a political target or a target for violence and threats, which is sort of an unfortunate topic that we have to discuss in a course like this, but certainly when we're thinking about the intersection between media and politics in 2021, we have to contend with the idea that journalists are increasingly targeted across the world, actually, as victims of violence and abuse. These are really worrying trends, and so a number of different groups have been looking at this over time, tracking this and trying to diagnose the issues and potentially solve some of these problems. One that I've linked in the module as a sort of supplementary reading or a supplementary site for you to surf is the Reporters Without Borders, or Reporters Sans Frontières organization, which does this job of identifying violence and threats against journalists all across the world. We see that both civil society groups and sort of non-aligned political factions are perpetuating violence against journalists, but also even political groups or groups that are designed to support specific electoral candidates are also coming together around threats against journalists and violence against journalists. Especially prevalent we see in Latin America and South America, in even the United States and other places, a populist communication style. If you recall, we read a paper that was talking about the populist communication style, highlighting the idea that the press is an enemy of this populist movement and creating an antagonism there on purpose. Right? That obviously is something that we can't ignore as a potential source of additional threats and violence. And really, when we think about it, this kind of scapegoating, this kind of ridicule can have devastating consequences all the way, as we'll see, from the psychological, in terms of people's lived experiences trying to do their jobs as journalists, all the way up to, again, premeditated murder of journalists. And so, again, this is a big issue that we need to contend with in our discussion, any discussion of politics and media today. And if we look at some of the most sort of egregious or the most worrying examples out there in the world, we can see, for example, that Syria really is the place in the world where the most journalists over time have been killed for a variety of reasons in recent times. Obviously, this ongoing conflict in Syria has resulted in very devastating and dangerous conditions for anyone. However, we've also seen that the existence of many rebel factions, many different groups that are competing for power in this area, have meant that journalists who are trying to do their jobs and report on what's happening on the ground in Syria are being targeted quite ruthlessly over time. And so the Committee to Protect Journalists, or the CPJ, which is another organization that tracks this kind of thing, have documented 155 journalists and media workers have been killed since 1992. And of those, we're able to identify that militant groups were sort of premeditatedly going after journalists in 23 instances. So many of these deaths were due to other reasons, or their motivations were not confirmed, but at least 23 have been confirmed to be attacks that were carried out specifically because this individual was carrying out a journalistic mission. And I think one individual that we can think about as a very notable example was freelance reporter James Foley, who was killed by the Islamic State in 2014 in Syria. So again, both United States journalists, other sort of foreign observers being killed in that context, but also we can't ignore, of course, many local journalists or journalists from Syria who are Syrian also being killed in that conflict. And so a very devastating situation, and one that, if we're going to talk about violence against journalists, and especially political and sort of military violence against journalists, this is probably the worst place in the world for this kind of action. Further, we can read about in the Relli and Gonzalez de Bustamante article from 2017 that in Mexico we're seeing many examples where cartels and other sort of non-state actors are doing a lot of violence against journalists, particularly when they observe things that the cartels are doing and they don't want that information to be shared. And so actually 125 journalists, according to the CPJ, have been killed in Mexico since 1992 for a variety of reasons. And I guess I would highlight the most recent individual in that data set was killed September 9th, 2020 in Veracruz, Julio Valdivia, who was reporting on a shootout involving rival gangs. We're not exactly sure what the sort of rationale was of this group that ultimately killed the reporter, Mr. Valdivia, but unfortunately he was targeted by this group, or one of these groups that he had been reporting on, and was unfortunately killed in a very violent way. And so again, these are really sort of arresting, startling statistics, I think, when we look at these. This is not that long of a time span, really, to think about this many professional journalists who are doing their job, simply reporting on what's going on in these countries. This is quite a sort of a catastrophic outcome for the industry, and certainly something that many journalists themselves and journalistic organizations are thinking about, and thinking about ways to protect each other and themselves. And of course, it goes without saying that with a discussion like this, those of us who have been living in Maryland for some time are well aware that this is not something that is confined to war zones like Syria or places like Mexico where violence is very endemic. The United States is also a place where violence against journalists has resulted in killings. 15, in fact, since 1992 on U.S. soil. And I think perhaps the most notable example of this is the Capital Gazette shooting, which was in Annapolis in 2018. If you're unaware of this event, I recommend that you check it out. Learn a little bit about what happened here. This was a very tragic moment, I think, for the community in Annapolis and in Maryland in general, but especially for the circumstances of how this happened, particularly because the murderer who perpetrated this mass shooting was motivated by a sort of mistaken or a deeply sort of outsized or overstated belief that the Gazette had somehow wronged him by reporting on him in a negative light. And so this individual perpetrated this attack not at random, but because he had this belief that the Capital Gazette had somehow tarnished his reputation. And so this is I think another part of this discussion is that journalists are also placing themselves in danger when they are reporting on public affairs, because at any given time, right, if they're reporting on things negatively, we could imagine that some people might, draw extreme conclusions and could, go as far as making threats against journalists and go even as far as this catastrophic outcome. And so, again, this is an incredibly tragic thing to have happened, especially the fact that it occurred in our own community, and really I think something that has led to a new focus on this topic. People thinking, how could this have happened? How is it that these threats went without substantial sort of follow up? This individual had contacted the Capital Gazette many times in the past with these sort of rambling screeds, and again, this is a very sad story that causes us, I think, as observers and as people who care in the community to look at this and say, what can be done differently to prevent something like this from ever happening again? So I hate to be talk about this stuff in a class like this where we're normally so upbeat, right, and talking about political theories from a little bit more of a distanced perspective. But this really hits close to home, I think, and it's something that we can't ignore as Americans. This is something that I think demands us asking important questions and potentially pursuing answers about how to solve this kind of thing before it happens again. So, again, right, if we think theoretically, if we try to evaluate why this is happening, why it is that journalists can be threatened, can be attacked, can be killed all across the world and even in our backyards, I think there's a number of reasons why journalists would be of sort of special significance or be especially vulnerable as members of our society. One thing, of course, is we've seen across the world. Jamal Khashoggi is somebody who I think is an example of this. where there are certainly motivated attempts by groups, both sort of political and in civil societies, to stifle watchdogs and to try to prevent the truth from getting out in many cases. And one way to do that is to threaten journalists, to intimidate them, and even potentially to kill them. And so there's a number of cases that we've seen, both in the cases, the country cases that we've examined already, and in other places as well, where we've seen that groups and organizations, both in the public sphere and in civil society, are trying to stop journalists from getting information out. And sometimes those things are resolved. Sometimes journalists are able to document their harassment or their victimization and seek restitution against individuals or groups that are doing this. And sometimes the results, as we've seen, are more catastrophic. Also, as we've seen, personal grudges and vendettas. We know that individuals can also have this kind of approach and harass journalists because of these maybe misplaced beliefs that the journalists have done them wrong somehow. Obviously, other reasons why journalists are victims of violence and intimidation. It could be that they are war reporters that are trying to go on the ground and document what's actually happening. I think it goes without saying that this is a very important job, and one that all the way back since the Vietnam War, since the first times that Americans really had the images and graphic depictions of war brought into their living rooms through television, reports. This is an extremely dangerous kind of assignment, but one that is very important for helping Americans understand what is really at stake when we engage in violent conflict, or what's at stake in other places, right? I mean, I think about, in recent times, we've seen examples of the sort of reawakening, perhaps, of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And, many United States journalists would go there and, attempt to report on what was happening for, I think, a very interested and concerned U.S. audience, especially given that many Irish Americans have ties, however distant or weak, to that area of the world. Many Americans wanted to know, right, what's happening there, and so war correspondents or correspondents who were reporting on civil conflicts would go into the action, right, and potentially expose themselves to serious risk to bring those stories to Americans. And so this could be another reason why we see that violence is perpetrated. Potentially, it could even be accidental in these cases. And then also we can talk about further accidents, danger in terms of assignments involving natural disasters, or even sometimes out there in the public, you can be reporting on something and some sort of catastrophic accident can occur, collapsing of scaffolding or something like that, and a journalist can also be killed simply as a result of their occupational hazards doing some of this reporting. So really, it's a very vulnerable position. I think it's an incredibly vulnerable position to be in, as somebody who's simply out there to try to gather information, and is maybe not always protected in the best of ways from some of these potential threats. And so again, I think as we think about politics specifically and its relationship to journalism, we have to keep in mind this idea that journalists who take seriously this watchdog role are doing so even when well aware of the possibility that these and other threats can occur. But to back up a little bit away from kind of the most serious, the most grave forms of sort of journalistic, perpetration of journalistic violence or violence against journalists, we also have to think about the idea that many attacks on journalists are not physical, but are actually verbal, right? Verbal harassment or even online harassment also is something that is very endemic in this business, especially because journalists are involved in the communication of information to the public. And so I've included in this week's reading, right, a chapter by Siegel, who's working, I think, on some really interesting stuff on the propagation and the sharing of online hate speech in online venues. And I think Siegel, she's got some really interesting, early kind of discussions in this chapter, the first couple of pages, where she's talking about what really we mean by hate speech. And I think it's important to think about the idea that there's no one settled definition of what hate speech is. And I think that's one reason why we have such a hard time putting our finger on exactly how much there is, where it's coming from, and how it spreads. And so we can think about more narrow definitions as being specifically dangerous speech that's directly linked to the incitement of mass violence against a group. So you can think about, I'm not going to obviously repeat any of those kinds of dangerous speech in this video, but you can think about the kinds of statements which would qualify for this type of thing, right? So you have a specific group that you're targeting, usually a minority group or a gender group or some other group. There's a threat of an incitement of mass violence. There's some kind of acknowledgement that somebody would like to perpetrate violence against that group, and it's usually associated, right, with the statement that is broad-based in nature and is designed to threaten and terrorize individuals who are reading it. But of course, we can go beyond that and say beyond just specific threats of violence, which are very questionable from even a First Amendment perspective. We can think about things that are maybe milder but still have a major psychological impact, such as some kind of individual harassment, right? Repeated disparagement of an individual, someone following them around the web and posting things. Slurs, obviously the use of various slurs and epithets against all kinds of groups might not rise to the level of dangerous speech as described this way, because it might not be a direct threat of mass violence, but it still has a chilling effect on that person's communication. And we can also think about coordinated and targeted attacks like doxing, where individuals share the personal information of an online user, their address, their telephone number, other identifying details, and then groups of individuals engaging in hate speech will actually bring that hate speech to the real world by doing things like ordering thousands of pizzas to their house as a prank, or calling in bomb threats in their places of work, or there's a phenomenon called swatting, where basically somebody will call in a threat to that person's address, and then a police presence will arrive, and it will obviously frighten that person to a great degree when the SWAT team descends on their house for a completely fabricated incident. So there's all kinds of examples here where this type of stuff really, it blurs the boundaries between what's online and what's offline. And I think that speaks to the idea that this dangerous speech, right? Like, we need to expand that definition to incorporate some of this stuff, because it's part of a broader sort of hate phenomenon that is certainly having major effects on our society and on the people who live in it. So I have some questions for you to think about as you're doing this reading, as you're pondering kind of some of this really heavy content for this week. The first one is, and Siegel certainly gets into this, right? If we think that hate speech is a problem, if we adhere to a more expanded definition of what it is, if we think that these slurs and these kinds of interpersonal harassment, people in their private messages giving them statements like this, if this is something that we care about and we want to try to remedy, how can we even find out where it's happening on a mass scale, given that so many messages on so many platforms are being shared over the internet in the matter of mere minutes or hours? How can we filter it? How can we detect it? I think is an important computational question, and certainly a question that we need to be asking of some of these platforms that are providing for this communication. Another thing is, how can we potentially limit hate speech, and especially its effects, right? Given its capacity for psychological harm, how can we try to reduce it, given that we might be able to detect it? Because that's a big difference, right? We can find out if it's out there, and then we can think about policies that are designed to do something about it, right? Are there ways that we can reduce it, to try to erase it from the web? Are there ways that we can sanction users who are perpetuating it? One, I think, interesting finding from the Siegel piece is that relatively few people are doing this on a regular basis, but those who do it extremely intensely. They're sort of constantly online, they're extremely embedded in networks, and they're extremely loud. And so this is one issue, right? Can we target these individuals? Can we do something to sanction them? And does that run us afoul of certain kinds of policies and laws that enshrine and protect many kinds of speech? And then finally, right, I'm interested in your thoughts about how we might monitor and prevent hate speech moving into the real world. Because if we think that hate speech is in many cases a precursor to real violence, do we think that, or do we have a strategy for sort of cutting this off, like breaking this connection and preventing these kinds of things from manifesting into real forms of violence, against journalists and against all kinds of different groups out there in the world who are victims of this kind of targeted and intentional harassment all the time. So what do we do about this, I think, is a question for us to consider. It's got a complicated answer, I think, is what I would say, just to get you going. This is maybe a set of questions that you might be inclined to say, well, we'll just end it and we'll make it stop. But really, I wish that it was that easy, right? This is something that's very pervasive, very endemic, and as we've said, right, it has very material consequences for people's lives and for their professions in 2021. So the last thing I'll say about this is I want to try to connect this also to broader discussions that we've had in a class about trust. Because we're noticing as social scientists, when we poll people and we ask them, how much do you trust various institutions like the Supreme Court, like the military, like Congress, like journalists, or journalistic institutions or the media, how much do you trust your neighbors? How much do you trust extended family? Basically all this stuff except basically the military. How much do you trust police? How much do you trust, librarians, education, right? Professors and universities. Pretty much everything except the military, maybe. We're seeing substantial declines in trust. On average, most Americans are far less trusting of almost every major institution in America, besides maybe the military in 2021 compared to, say, the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so it's clear that trust in general is declining, and this is also affecting the role of journalists as well, because it seems likely that as this trust in this institution declines, it becomes a lot easier to say, well, I don't trust these people. I think that this is a faulty enterprise. This is not something that I support. Therefore, it's much easier for me to think of them as an enemy, and it's much more easy to threaten them as being this sort of outgroup. So I guess one question that I have for you, kind of a last thought before I let you take care of this reading and prepare for our discussion. How might journalists, policymakers, maybe social scientists, people who are doing this research, other groups, public intellectuals, people who are having a debate out there in the public sphere, blue checkmark people on Twitter, maybe, right? Pundits, editorialists, whoever, right? How might we as kind of, opinion leaders in America, how could we work to try to restore trust in the journalistic enterprise? Do we think that this is something that might help alleviate some of these threats? Or is really this a failed or a hopeless endeavor, right? Is it maybe not possible to get people to trust journalists or the practice of, profession of journalism again, given the fact that we have such a polarized political environment where, even also a polarized media environment as well, where there's no one sort of source. There's an infinite array of, as we've seen, highly polarized, highly fragmented, highly sensationalist kinds of media today. Is it possible that this kind of attempt to get people to believe in journalism again is either extraordinarily difficult or maybe even impossible? So I just want to try to connect some of these ideas about trust to this decline in support for and eventually increase in hate towards journalists as an organization or as an institution or as a occupation. I think this is an important thing to think about as we go forward. So again, a grim, a difficult set of conversations to have this week, but I really look forward to not thinking too much, not dwelling too much on the contours of the problem now that we're aware of what those are, but maybe looking forward to the future and thinking about ways that we could try to unmake the problem that we find ourselves in terms of both violence against, threats against, and really sort of antagonism towards journalism as a profession in 2021. So good luck with this. I hope that the reading is helpful to you, and I very much look forward to our conversation during the next class period. I'll see you all very soon.